Morning sunlight enters our contemporary apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows. A gorgeous morning, right out of a lifestyle magazine. Amid the scent of freshly brewed coffee, James walked idly across the kitchen. Every day began methodically and precisely, as if life were a checklist. "Today will be long," he murmured, pouring coffee into a stylish ceramic mug. After 2 meetings, I promised Ted would review the quarterly report. As my fingertips rested on the spine of an unopened book, I nodded absent-mindedly, pretending to listen. James was good at planning, strategizing, and problem-solving. He excelled in all areas. Recently, I saw a divide between us, a wall of habits and routines we both avoided addressing. "Did you sleep well?" he inquired, his voice carrying real worry. "Yeah, fine," I said with a practiced smile. Inside, I remembered last week. Dinner with family. I couldn't grasp Victor's glance, which lingered just long enough to evoke anything. I had been thinking about his deep, calm, authoritative voice ever since. Later the afternoon, I went to the gym, one of the few places where I could clear my head or try to. Treadmill hums and weight clinking created white noise, drowning out my worrying thoughts. I was adjusting machine settings when I heard his voice. "Help needed?" He was there when I turned. Victor, dressed in a plain black t-shirt that clung to his broad shoulders and charcoal gray sweatpants. He looked casual, yet composed, as if he belonged everywhere. "Sure," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. He adjusted the weight for me, his fingers brushing mine briefly. "You shouldn't push too hard at the start. Build up to it." His advice was simple, but the way he said it made my pulse quicken. We exchanged a few more words, polite and measured, but the air between us was heavy with something unspoken. He complimented my form, something about how I carried myself with confidence, and I laughed it off, pretending not to notice the spark that passed between us. When he walked away, I caught myself watching him, and a faint blush crept into my cheeks. What was I doing? The drive home was a blur of half-formed thoughts. The cityscape zipped past my window, a kaleidoscope of motion and color. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, as if grounding myself could keep my mind from spiraling. What was it about him? Was it the way he carried himself, so assured and effortless? Or was it the quiet understanding in his eyes, as if he could see parts of me that even I couldn't? I shook my head, scolding myself silently. It was nothing, a momentary lapse. Victor was my stepfather, not by blood, but by circumstance, a detail that didn't make my thoughts any less inappropriate. When I arrived home, James was at his desk, focused on his laptop. He looked up briefly, offering me a warm smile. "How was your workout?" "Good," I said, forcing another smile. I wanted to tell him everything, to confess this sudden, inexplicable attraction, and let him reassure me that it was nothing. But how could I? Even admitting it felt like a betrayal. So, I swallowed my words and leaned into the predictable comfort of our routine, trying to convince myself that it was enough. Yet deep down, a part of me was already waiting for the next time I'd see Victor. The hum of conversation filled the house as another family dinner unfolded. Laughter and clinking glasses created a warm backdrop, but I felt like an outsider in my own home. The evening had been orchestrated by my mother, Megan, with her typical precision. Everything was perfect, on the surface at least. I drifted into the kitchen, craving a moment of solitude away from the polished conversations about vacations, promotions, and wine pairings. As I poured myself a glass of water, I felt his presence before I saw him. Victor stepped into the room, his movements deliberate, yet unassuming. He had a way of commanding attention without demanding it. "Escaping the crowd?" he asked, his voice smooth and low. I nodded, suddenly hyper-aware of the way the fabric of my dress clung to my skin under his gaze. "Needed a break," I said, trying to sound casual. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "That color suits you, brings out your confidence." A compliment, harmless on the surface. But the way he said it, with a faint smile that barely reached his eyes, sent a shiver down my spine. I glanced away, pretending to adjust my glass. "You always notice things like that?" I asked, attempting a light-hearted tone. "Only when they're worth noticing," he replied, his gaze steady. The room seemed smaller, the air heavier. I wanted to respond with something witty, something to diffuse the tension, but my mind betrayed me. All I could feel was the electric charge between us, unspoken yet undeniable. The evening dragged on, and when it was finally time to leave, I breathed a sigh of relief. The cool night air hit my skin as I stepped outside, wrapping myself in my coat. Victor appeared moments later, offering to walk me to my car. It was a simple gesture, one that shouldn't have meant anything, but my heart raced all the same. "You seemed quiet tonight," he said as we reached my car. "Everything okay?" I hesitated, my hand resting on the car door. "Just tired, I guess. These dinners can be exhausting." He nodded, stepping closer. "I get that, but you shouldn't let it wear you down. You have a light about you, Lori. Don't let it dim." The way he said my name, soft, intimate, felt like an unraveling. I turned to face him, searching for something in his expression. Was it concern? Admiration? Something darker? "Victor," I began, but the words caught in my throat. He reached out, his hand brushing my arm, a touch so subtle yet charged with intent. Before I could think, before I could process, his lips found mine. It was brief, a whisper of a kiss, but it ignited something in me I couldn't contain. I pulled back, my breath shallow, my mind spinning. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice thick with regret. Or was it something else? I shouldn't have. But I was already shaking my head, fumbling for my car keys. "I have to go," I said, my voice barely audible. I got into the car and drove away, my hands gripping the wheel like a lifeline. The city lights blurred as tears pricked at the corners of my eyes. What just happened? And why, despite the guilt gnawing at my chest, did I want it to happen again? When I arrived home, James was in the living room, reviewing documents on his laptop. He looked up as I walked in, his face lighting up with that familiar, dependable smile. "Hey, how was dinner?" he asked. "Fine," I replied, dropping my coat onto the back of a chair. My voice sounded strained even to me, but he didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he chose not to. "You look tired," he said, standing to kiss me on the forehead. "Why don't you get some rest?" "I'll finish up here." "Yeah, good idea," I muttered, retreating to the bedroom. As I sat on the edge of the bed, the events of the night replayed in my mind. Victor's touch, his words, his kiss. They consumed me. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a precipice, unsure whether to step back or let myself fall. Why? I whispered to the empty room. Why him? Why now? I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that everything had changed in an instant, and there was no going back. Sitting at my kitchen table the next morning, I stared at my phone. The house was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of papers from James in the study. My fingers hovered over the screen, debating whether to type out the message I'd been rehearsing in my head for hours. "Hi, Victor. I was thinking about what happened. Maybe we should talk?" No, too direct. "Victor, I wanted to ask you something about the family dinner. Too obvious." After minutes that felt like hours, I settled on a safer option. "Hi, Victor. I realized I forgot to mention something about Mom's plans for the holidays. Can we meet?" It was vague, innocuous. At least that's what I told myself. I hit send, my heart pounding as I waited for the ellipse to appear. When his response came, it was quick and precise. "Sure. Let me know when you're free." We met at a small cafe on the quieter side of the city. It was a place I chose intentionally, far from familiar faces. Victor was already seated when I arrived, his hands wrapped around a coffee cup as he scanned the menu. He looked up when I approached, his expression neutral, but his eyes gave away a flicker of something deeper. "Lori," he greeted, standing briefly before motioning for me to sit. "What's on your mind?" His tone was casual, but the weight of our last encounter hung heavily between us. I hesitated, fiddling with the handle of my bag before blurting out, "I just thought we should clear the air after, you know." Victor's lips quirked into a half smile. "After the kiss, you mean?" The way he said it, so matter-of-fact, so unashamed, made my pulse quicken. I looked away, feeling the heat rise in my cheeks. "It was a mistake," I said, though the words felt hollow even as I said them. "Was it?" he asked, leaning forward slightly. His voice was low, steady, drawing me in despite my better judgment. "It has to be," I replied, more to convince myself than him. "You're my stepfather," he finished for me. "By title, yes, but you and I both know that's not the whole story." I opened my mouth to protest, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I felt his hand brush against mine as he reached for his cup. It was subtle, deliberate. The contact sent a shiver up my spine, and for a moment, I forgot where we were. "Victor," I began, pulling my hand back. "This can't happen. It's wrong. And yet, here we are," he said simply. The silence that followed was thick with tension. I stood abruptly, needing to escape before I said or did something I couldn't take back. I should go, I said, grabbing my bag. Lori, Victor called after me, his voice softer now. You can keep pretending, or you can admit the truth to yourself at least. I didn't look back as I walked out, but his words followed me all the way home. At home, James was waiting with a bottle of wine and a hopeful smile. I thought we could have a quiet night together, he said, gesturing toward the neatly set dining table. I forced a smile, nodding as I hung up my coat. That sounds nice. But as the evening wore on, I found it harder to focus. James talked about his day, about a new client at work, about his plans for the weekend. I responded when prompted, but my mind was elsewhere, back in the cafe, replaying every word, every glance, every fleeting touch. You're quiet tonight, James observed, reaching across the table to take my hand. His touch was warm, familiar, but it lacked the spark I couldn't stop craving. Just tired, I lied, pulling my hand away to refill my glass. He didn't press, but I could see the concern in his eyes. Later, when he leaned in to kiss me goodnight, I turned my face slightly, letting his lips brush my cheek instead. He hesitated, pulling back to study me. Everything okay? He asked. Of course, I replied quickly. I've just had a lot on my mind. He nodded, though his expression remained uncertain. As he turned off the lights and climbed into bed, I stayed behind, staring at my reflection in the darkened window. What was wrong with me? James was everything I should want. Kind, stable, devoted. But as much as I hated myself for it, I couldn't stop comparing him to Victor. His certainty felt stifling, where Victor's unpredictability felt exhilarating. The guilt was unbearable, but it wasn't enough to silence the thought that kept surfacing, no matter how hard I tried to push it away. I wanted more. The bustling restaurant hummed with energy as waiters darted between tables and conversations overlapped in a symphony of city life. I sat across from Emma, swirling my glass of water absently, as she launched into another story about her latest misadventure at work. Her voice, normally full of sarcasm and wit, barely registered with me. Are you even listening? She asked, narrowing her eyes. Of course, I lied, offering a weak smile. Something about your boss being a dictator again? Sheck sighed, shaking her head. You're off in your own world lately. What's going on, Lori? Trouble in paradise? I hesitated, fiddling with the edge of the napkin. No, everything's fine, just work stress, I guess. Emmy didn't buy it, but she let it slide, moving on to her next topic. I nodded along, forcing responses when necessary, but my attention was elsewhere, or rather, on someone else. I saw him before he saw me. Victor, seated alone at the bar, his posture relaxed as he scanned the menu. He was dressed in a dark blazer over a crisp white shirt, effortlessly commanding attention. My pulse quickened, and I immediately looked away, hoping he wouldn't notice me. Earth to Lori, Emmy said, waving a hand in front of my face. You're seriously out of it. I'm fine, I insisted, but the sudden dryness in my throat betrayed me. When Emmy finally got up to take a phone call, I considered bolting. But before I could gather my things, Victor appeared at my table, a casual smile playing on his lips. Small world, he said, pulling out the chair Emmy had just vacated. Mind if I join you? Victor, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. What are you doing here? Having lunch, same as you, he replied, leaning back in the chair as if we were old friends catching up. Your friend won't mind, will she? I glanced toward the entrance, where Emmy was still animatedly gesturing into her phone. She won't be long, I said, my tone sharper than intended. Victor raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement in his expression. Relax, Lori. I'm not here to cause trouble. We fell into a conversation that was both maddeningly casual and loaded with subtext. He asked about my work, my hobbies, even about James. Each question felt like a test, his tone light but his eyes piercing. I tried to keep my answers neutral, but the tension was palpable. You always seem so composed, he remarked, his voice dropping slightly, but I can't help wondering what's going on beneath the surface. Before I could respond, Em returned, shooting Victor a curious look. Friend of yours? She asked. Family, I said quickly, the word feeling foreign on my tongue. Victor, this is Emma. They exchanged polite nods, but the energy at the table had shifted. Emmy's presence was a buffer, keeping our conversation safely superficial, until she excused herself again, this time to pay the bill. As soon as she left, Victor leaned in slightly, his voice low. You didn't tell me you'd be here, trying to avoid me? It's not like that, I said, my heart pounding. This is just coincidence, he finished, a sly smile tugging at his lips. But it's funny, isn't it? How often these coincidences seem to happen. I stood abruptly, grabbing my bag. I should go. Victor rose with me, his expression unreadable. Let me walk you out. The cold air outside was a stark contrast to the warmth of the restaurant, biting at my skin as Victor fell into step beside me. When we reached my car, I turned to face him, ready to say goodbye, but the words caught in my throat. His gaze held mine, steady and unyielding, and before I could stop myself, I whispered, "This has to stop." "Does it?" he asked, his voice barely audible. I opened my mouth to argue, but he stepped closer, his hand brushing my arm in a way that sent a jolt through me. The space between us disappeared, and then his lips were on mine. This time, there was no hesitation, no restraint. His hands found my waist, pulling me closer as the kiss deepened, igniting something I couldn't control. When we finally pulled apart, I was breathless, my mind spinning. Victor's expression was a mix of desire and something darker, something I couldn't name. "This is wrong," I said, my voice shaky. "We can't." "But we are," he interrupted, "and pretending otherwise won't change it." I turned and got into my car, gripping the steering wheel as I tried to steady my breathing. My reflection in the rearview mirror was a stranger's face, flushed, disheveled, and utterly confused. When I got home, James was waiting, a small gift box in hand. "I thought I'd surprise you," he said, his smile warm and genuine. Inside the box was a delicate bracelet, something I might have adored under different circumstances. "Thank you," I said, forcing enthusiasm into my voice. He pulled me into a hug, but instead of comfort, I felt a wave of guilt crash over me. As he held me, his warmth only highlighted the emptiness inside me, a void I knew Victor could fill. That night, as James slept soundly beside me, I stared at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the kiss. I was losing myself, and the worst part was I didn't want to stop. Victor's invitation came unexpectedly, though I'd been half expecting it ever since our kiss outside the restaurant. His message was as carefully worded as ever. "Let's talk. It's about your mother's plans for the holidays. My place tomorrow evening." It was practical, impersonal on the surface, but I knew better. This wasn't about family logistics, and we both knew it. Despite the alarm bells ringing in my head, I found myself agreeing. His apartment was everything I expected. Sleek, modern, and impeccably arranged. The kind of place that reflected his character. Controlled, composed, but with subtle touches of warmth. A framed photo of him and my mother on a vacation they'd taken hung on the wall, a glaring reminder of how wrong this was. "Drink?" he asked, already pouring a glass of wine. "Just water," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. He raised an eyebrow, but didn't comment, handing me a glass and gesturing toward the couch. I sat on the edge, my body tense, clutching the glass as if it were an anchor. So I began, searching for something to say. "You mentioned holiday plans?" Victor leaned against the back of the chair across from me, his posture relaxed, but his eyes intent. "Do we really need to pretend that's why you're here?" The question hung in the air, heavy and inescapable. I opened my mouth to protest, but the words wouldn't come. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his gaze never leaving mine. "Lori," he said softly, his voice both gentle and commanding. "Why are you really here?" "I don't know," I admitted, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "I don't know what I'm doing or why I—" "Because it feels real," he interrupted, his tone steady but not unkind. "Because for once you're not following the script." His words struck a chord I didn't want to acknowledge. He was right. For all the guilt and confusion swirling inside me, there was also a spark of something undeniable, something that had been missing from my life for far too long. "I can't do this," I whispered, shaking my head. Victor stood and crossed the room, stopping just short of where I sat. He didn't touch me, not yet, but his presence was overwhelming. "Then tell me to stop," he said simply. I looked up at him, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. He reached out, his hand brushing against my cheek, and for a moment time seemed to stand still. His touch was light, almost hesitant, but it set my entire body alight. "You should go," he murmured, though his hand didn't move. "Do you want me to?" I asked, my voice trembling. "No," he admitted, his thumb grazing my jawline. "But I will if that's what you want." I couldn't answer. Instead, I leaned into his touch, my breath hitching as his hand slid to the back of my neck. The tension that had been building for weeks finally snapped as his lips found mine. This kiss was different.